Emma had always been drawn to the old and mysterious. From ancient books to dusty relics, she felt an inexplicable connection to the past. It was no surprise then that one rainy afternoon, while browsing a small antique shop nestled between two large buildings in the heart of the city, she found herself staring at an old mirror. The shop was quiet, almost eerily so. The musty smell of age and dust hung in the air, and the low hum of the neon sign outside flickered weakly, casting a dim glow through the dusty windows. As she wandered through the narrow aisles, Emma's eyes landed on a tall, ornate mirror that seemed to call out to her. Its frame was intricately carved with designs of vines and faces twisted into grim expressions. The glass itself, though old, was flawless, reflecting her image with an unnerving clarity. But something about it made her uneasy, a subtle twinge in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with deeply wrinkled skin and eyes that seemed too knowing for his age, appeared from the shadows. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Ah, you found it," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's an antique from a distant land. Very rare, and, well, very special." Emma gave a nervous laugh, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Special?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "How?" The old man leaned closer, his eyes flickering with a strange intensity. "It's said to hold memories. Memories of those who have looked into it. Some say it shows you more than your reflection, something darker." Emma smiled politely, dismissing it as just another one of the shopkeeper's stories to sell an old object. But deep down, she felt an odd pull toward the mirror. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like it belonged in her apartment. After a brief pause, she turned to the shopkeeper. "How much?" The old man's eyes glinted with something dark and knowing. "A fair price for such a powerful piece. But beware," he added in a hushed tone. "Not all who gaze into it are ready for what they see." Despite the odd warning, Emma handed over the money and left the shop, the mirror wrapped carefully in a thick cloth. She didn't feel fear, at least not in the way she thought she should. Instead, she felt exhilarated. She had found something truly unique, something that others would envy. When she placed the mirror in her living room, it felt right. It reflected the room perfectly, casting an eerie glow on the walls. As she stood before it, Emma couldn't help but wonder what secrets it held. But she quickly shook off the thought. She had always loved antique objects. This one was no different, right? That night, after a long day of work, Emma sat on the couch with a glass of wine, the mirror catching the light from the dim lamp beside her. As she relaxed, she noticed something strange. The reflection seemed off. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of the mirror. She chalked it up to the wine or the lighting. But then she saw it again. A shadow, moving behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Emma laughed nervously, dismissing it as nothing more than a trick of the light. She turned back to the mirror, but the strange feeling lingered. The reflection in the glass seemed slightly darker now, the shadows around the edges of the room more pronounced. She reached out to touch the surface of the mirror, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. The moment her skin made contact, she felt a chill crawl up her spine, a prickling sensation that made her hand jerk back. Her reflection stared back at her, unchanged, but something deep within her gut told her something wasn't right. Emma shook her head, trying to shake off the unease. It's just an old mirror, she thought, nothing more. But as the night wore on, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. The mirror, once a simple decoration, now seemed to have a life of its own. And no matter where she was in the room, her eyes would always be drawn back to it. The days following the purchase of the mirror were uneventful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The strange unease, the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of her mind. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks. But every time she looked at the mirror, there was something unsettling about it. It was a rainy Thursday evening when the first vision appeared. Emma had just finished work and was sitting at her desk, papers scattered in front of her. The low hum of the city outside filtered through the window, mixing with the soft patter of rain against the glass. She was tired, her mind numb from hours of staring at her computer screen. But something about the mirror, sitting in the corner of her living room, kept pulling her attention. She didn't want to look at it, not again, but her eyes betrayed her. She glanced over. First, everything seemed normal. The mirror reflected the dimly lit room, the furniture, the soft glow of the lamp. But as Emma's gaze lingered, something shifted. The shadows in the mirror seemed deeper, more defined. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the frame of the glass. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. That's impossible, she thought. It must have been a trick of the light, or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. The next evening, she couldn't resist. She found herself drawn to the mirror again, her curiosity getting the best of her. As she walked over to it, the room felt colder than usual. The warmth from the lamp didn't seem to reach the corner where the mirror stood. She stood in front of it for a moment, her breath fogging up the glass as she stared at her reflection. Everything seemed fine until she saw it again. Figure just behind her in the mirror. She whipped around, but no one was there. Her pulse quickened, and she stumbled backward, her heart racing. She took a few deep breaths, trying to steady herself. This is ridiculous, she told herself. It's just the angle of the light or my eyes playing tricks. But something told her that was not the case. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the image of that shadowy figure lingered in her mind. She tossed and turned, unable to sleep. It was as though the mirror was calling to her, pulling her thoughts toward it. She tried to shake the feeling off, but the room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. The wind howled outside, and the soft creaking of the apartment made her feel even more uneasy. She glanced over at the mirror from her bed, the faint light from the street lamp casting a dim glow into the room. The reflection in the mirror seemed different. It wasn't exactly like her bedroom, not in the way it should have been. The colors were off, the shadows darker, as if the room in the mirror wasn't quite the same as the one she was in. Then she saw it. Figure standing just inside the door. She froze, staring at the reflection, her heart hammering in her chest. It was too dark to make out details, but there was no mistaking the shape of someone or something standing there. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its presence felt suffocating. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, as if it was waiting for something. Emma felt her throat go dry. This isn't real, she tried to convince herself. Can't be. But then the figure stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. The air felt thick, heavy. The shadows in the mirror seemed to grow, pulling the figure closer, drawing it nearer to her. Her pulse raced, and she could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The figure's face was still shrouded in darkness. She could barely make out its features, but its presence was unmistakable. An overwhelming feeling of dread, as if something ancient and malevolent was staring at her, judging her. She tried to blink, hoping that when she opened her eyes again, it would all be gone. But when she did, the figure was still there, closer now, standing just inches from her reflection. Emma, the voice was faint, barely a whisper, but she heard it. Her blood ran cold. She jumped out of bed, stumbling as she ran toward the light switch, her body trembling. She flipped the switch, but the room stayed dark, and when she glanced back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Shaking, Emma stood there for a long time, staring at her reflection in the glass, as if waiting for something more. But the mirror remained still, silent, its surface calm and empty. Yet, in the pit of her stomach, she knew that something wasn't right. She knew that this wasn't the end. The mirror had shown her something. Something more was coming. She could feel it, as if the air itself had thickened with dread, as if the mirror was waiting, watching, calling her to uncover its secrets. That night, as Emma tried to fall asleep, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle in the wind outside made her jump. And as she lay there, she couldn't help but wonder, what if the mirror was calling her back? The next few days felt like a blur for Emma. She tried to return to her usual routine, but something had changed. It wasn't just the unease in her gut, the constant feeling of being watched. It was the mirror. It was like it had somehow crept into her thoughts, her dreams, and her waking moments. The whispers had started. At first, they were faint, like a soft hum, barely audible above the noise of her everyday life. She would hear them while doing mundane things, cooking, walking down the hallway, or even while sitting on the couch. It was always the same, soft, insistent murmurs, like voices just out of reach. Every time she tried to focus on them, they would fade away, leaving her with a strange sense of emptiness. But over time, the whispers grew louder. One evening, Emma sat down on her couch after a long day at work. She hadn't looked at the mirror since the night the figure had appeared, but the unsettling feeling remained. She couldn't stop thinking about it. She had tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, that she was tired or stressed, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The mirror was calling to her. The moment she glanced at it from the corner of her eye, she felt the chill again. The air grew colder, and she heard the faintest whisper. Emma, her heart raced, and she turned to face the mirror. The reflection was the same as it always was, her living room, the furniture, the dim light from the lamp, but there was something different about it. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were shifting and moving in ways that didn't make sense. The whispers grew louder now, filling her ears. Look into it. Emma's hands trembled as she stood, rooted to the spot. Her mind screamed at her to look away, to run, to do anything but stay there, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as if the mirror had a hold on her, a grip on her very soul. Why are you afraid, Emma? The voice whispered again, this time clearer, more distinct. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run out of the room, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped in the grip of the mirror, her eyes glued to the reflection as if some invisible force was drawing her in. Slowly, the figure appeared again. It was back, standing just outside the frame of the mirror, just like the first time. But this time, it was different. The figure's face was more visible. A twisted, contorted smile stretched across its face, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. It wasn't human. It was something darker, something unnatural. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The figure's smile grew wider, more sinister. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a sharp pang of fear rip through her chest. You can't escape, the voice said, this time coming from the figure's mouth, but its voice was cold, hollow. You belong to me now, Emma. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, the air thickening with dread. Her hands shook as she reached for the light switch, but it felt miles away. Every inch closer to the switch felt like an eternity. No, please, Emma whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. "I don't want this. I just want it to stop." But the figure didn't move. It simply stared at her, its grin widening with every second. Emma felt something snap inside her. She couldn't take it anymore. She stumbled backward, her eyes never leaving the mirror. The figure remained frozen, its dark, hollow eyes still locked onto hers, as if it was waiting for her to do something, to make a choice. "Please," Emma begged again, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. And then, in a voice like 1,000 voices whispering at once, it answered, "Everything." With that, the figure lunged forward. Emma screamed as she felt a cold rush of air push past her, as though something was reaching through the mirror to grab her. Her heart raced, and her legs finally gave way beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor. The room spun, her vision blurring as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. She could still hear the whispers, louder now, more insistent, echoing in her head. She wanted to get away. She wanted to leave, but the mirror held her captive, its power growing stronger with every passing second. It was only then that Emma realized something terrifying. The figure wasn't just in the mirror. It was inside her. She could feel it, like a dark presence crawling under her skin, twisting through her thoughts. The whispers were no longer distant. They were in her head, right next to her ear, filling her mind with images she couldn't escape. The mirror wasn't just showing her things. It was manipulating her, changing her from the inside out. "You belong to me," the voice echoed again, louder now. "Forever." She closed her eyes, hoping it was all just a nightmare. But when she opened them again, the figure was still there, watching, waiting. She could feel it, its cold gaze on her, its presence suffocating. Emma scrambled to her feet, running toward the door. She had to leave. She had to get out of this apartment, out of the room, away from the mirror. But just as she reached the door, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if something was pulling her back. "Don't leave, Emma." She froze, her hand on the door handle. The voice was no longer just a whisper, it was an order. She let go of the handle, her heart hammering in her chest. The room felt darker, colder, and the weight of the mirror's presence was unbearable. It had claimed her, and she knew deep down that there was no escaping it, no running from it. Emma collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. The whispers continued to echo in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. "You can't escape," they repeated, like a broken record. But then, through the noise, she heard something else. A voice, clearer than the rest. "You're not alone, Emma." Emma's eyes snapped open. The voice was different. It was familiar. It was her own. But it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the mirror. Emma couldn't breathe. The whispering voices filled her mind, their cold, clammy fingers reaching deep into her thoughts. She shook her head violently, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. It felt like the mirror was sucking the very life out of her. As she lay on the floor, trembling, the dark figure's face haunted her. It wasn't just a reflection. It was as if it had a presence of its own, alive in the room with her. It was inside her now, her mind, her soul, clawing its way through every thought she had. "You're not alone, Emma." The voice echoed again, clearer now. She stood up with a jerk, almost knocking herself over in the process. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. She backed away from the mirror, her legs shaking as if the ground itself was unstable beneath her. "What do you want from me?" Emma whispered through clenched teeth, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. She didn't want to be controlled anymore. She needed answers, and she was going to find them. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The figure in the mirror seemed to smile wider, its hollow eyes glinting with malice. "I want everything," it hissed, its voice like ice scraping across stone. Emma felt a sharp, cold pain shoot through her chest. She gasped for air, clutching her shirt as if trying to hold herself together. She was slipping. She could feel herself breaking piece by piece. But deep down, somewhere beneath the terror, there was a glimmer of determination. She couldn't let the mirror win. She had to understand it, to fight back. Her mind raced as she scanned the room for something, anything that might help. And that's when she saw it. The old journal, tucked away on the bookshelf, half hidden beneath a pile of papers. It was the journal of the previous owner, the one who had left her the mirror. With trembling hands, Emma grabbed it and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but there were clear words on the first page. I didn't believe it at first. The mirror, it showed me things I couldn't explain, things I didn't want to see. But now I know the truth. It's cursed. Emma's heart raced as she read on, her fingers trembling over the pages. The mirror was once part of a collection, passed down through generations. It was made by a craftsman known for his dark arts, someone who believed that objects could hold souls. The mirrors, the paintings, the cursed relics, they were all made to trap the spirits of the dead. And they do. They don't just reflect what's in front of them. They pull you in. They take a part of you with them. The words blurred in front of her eyes. She was dizzy, her head spinning, but she forced herself to keep reading. I thought I could escape. I thought I could lock the mirror away, forget about it. But it never forgets. It always comes back. It waits. The next few pages were hastily written, the words messy and frantic. Emma's hands shook harder as she turned the pages. I'm not sure what happened. It started with the whispers. I heard them in the night. Then, I saw the shadows moving in the reflection, but they were always behind me. I tried to run, but the more I fought, the worse it got. The figure, it wants me, and I can't escape it. Emma's breath hitched. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The journal's last entry was a frantic scribble. I see it now. I see it in my dreams. It's in the mirror, and it's in my mind. It knows everything about me. It's controlling me. I think it's too late for me. Please, if anyone finds this, destroy the mirror. Burn it. Do anything, but don't let it trap you. The last words were smudged, as if someone had been trying to erase them. But the ink was still there, staining the paper. Emma stared at the journal, her heart racing. The man who had owned the mirror before her hadn't been able to escape it, and now neither could she. The whispers had started for him, and they had started for her. The figure in the mirror, it was never going to let her go. She slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing in the room. She had to do something. She had to get rid of it. But how? The journal didn't offer any answers. It only left her with more questions. Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, colder than anything Emma had ever felt before. It was as if the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. She could see her breath fogging in the air. The whispers, those maddening whispers, grew louder again. Emma? The voice was a low hiss, almost too soft to hear, but she felt it. It was right behind her. She turned, her heart stopping in her chest. There, in the reflection of the mirror, stood the figure. But this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was closer, so much closer. The twisted face grinned at her, its eyes burning with a fiery intensity. It was smiling, but there was no joy in that smile, only hunger. A hunger for her, a hunger for her soul. You can't run, the voice rasped, its cold fingers wrapping around her heart. Emma took a step back, her legs unsteady, but her mind was racing. She couldn't run. There was nowhere to hide. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The figure in the mirror was still smiling, but now it was moving, slowly, but steadily. Emma could hear the floor creak beneath her feet. She backed away from the mirror, her breath shallow and quick. The figure's grin seemed to stretch even further, its mouth widening impossibly. "You belong to me," it whispered, its voice rising with intensity. Forever. Emma's heart raced. This was it. She had to act. She couldn't just stand there and wait for it to take her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything. And then her gaze fell on the journal again. The last words of the previous owner were clear in her mind. Destroy the mirror. With a burst of panic-fueled energy, Emma grabbed the journal and sprinted toward the mirror. She didn't know how, but she had to destroy it. She had to stop the whispers, stop the figure. As she raised the journal above her head, ready to slam it down, the mirror seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. The figure in the reflection was laughing now, its voice full of malice and dark joy. "You can't destroy me," it jeered. Emma's grip tightened on the journal. She couldn't stop now, but deep down, she knew that the mirror had only just begun to show her its true power. Emma's breath was ragged, her hands trembling as she held the journal high above her head. The mirror seemed to mock her, its glass pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The figure inside smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. "You can't stop it," the voice hissed, growing louder, colder, almost suffocating. "You can't escape me." The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. Emma's head spun as if she were caught in a whirlwind. The whispers, that constant buzzing in her mind, had grown into a cacophony of voices. Each one seemed to call her name, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "Emma, Emma." Her heart raced in her chest, each beat like a drum that echoed in the silence of the room. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her vision blurry as she tried to focus. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had become something real, something that reached out to her, that sought to drag her in. Emma's fingers gripped the journal harder, knuckles turning white. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her. It was now or never. She had to destroy the mirror. The figure was already too close, too powerful. But how? She glanced down at the journal, the worn pages with their frantic scrawlings. The journal had been the previous owner's only warning, but it wasn't enough. There had to be more. There had to be a way to break the curse, to end this madness once and for all. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the mirror. It seemed to be waiting, watching her, its surface smooth and unblemished. The figure's eyes locked with hers, its smile still twisted and full of malice. "You don't have the strength," it said, its voice now a soft, taunting whisper. "You are mine, Emma. Forever." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it, the pull. The mirror was drawing her in, like a magnet, and she had no strength to fight it. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen. Her feet felt like they were stuck in place, as if the very ground beneath her had turned to stone. And then she remembered something in the journal, something she hadn't noticed before. Her hands shook as she opened the pages again, scanning the words quickly. The journal was filled with warnings and fears, but there was one sentence that stood out, hidden beneath the rest, almost as if it were meant to be ignored. "The mirror cannot claim you if you face it." It was simple, almost too simple to be true. But Emma didn't have time to question it. She had to act. With a sudden burst of willpower, Emma stepped forward. Her feet felt heavy, but she pushed through the weight, each step bringing her closer to the mirror. The figure inside watched her with a hungry grin, its eyes narrowing. "No," it growled. "You can't defeat me." But Emma ignored it. She had to face it. She had to face her fear, the darkness, the force that had taken hold of her mind. She couldn't let it win. When she reached the mirror, she stared into her own reflection. Her heart pounded, her breathing shallow. The figure in the mirror stood behind her, its presence like a shadow, but it was no longer a reflection. It felt real, like it was right behind her. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. She could feel the mirror's pull, the weight of its curse wrapping around her like invisible chains. But she wasn't going to let it take her, not like the others. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting her own in the mirror. She wasn't going to look away. She wasn't going to give in. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. The figure's grin faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. It was a crack in its control. "You should be," the voice hissed again, but this time, there was a flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't as strong, not as powerful. Emma's hands gripped the journal tighter, her knuckles white. She could feel the power of the mirror trying to fight back, but she wasn't going to let it control her anymore. She took a deep breath, then threw the journal at the mirror with all her might. The book hit the glass with a loud crack, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, the room exploded with sound. The whispers, the voices, the growls, all merged into one overwhelming roar. The mirror shuddered violently, its surface rippling like water. The figure's face twisted in agony, its once menacing smile now a distorted mask of rage and fear. Emma staggered backward, her eyes wide with disbelief. The mirror was shaking violently, and the figure was no longer in control. The glass began to crack, a jagged line splitting down the center. "No!" The figure screamed, its voice a twisted wail. "You can't destroy me." But it was too late. The cracks spread faster now, splitting the mirror wide open. Emma could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, a freezing chill settling over her. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, watching as the mirror shattered, the pieces falling to the floor in a cascade of glass and light. The room fell into an eerie silence. Emma collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She looked around, her heart still racing. The oppressive presence was gone, and the air felt lighter, clearer. But even as she let out a sigh of relief, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching her, waiting. The darkness hadn't completely disappeared. It was still lurking, hiding in the corners of her mind. Emma knew that destroying the mirror hadn't ended the curse. The evil that had been unleashed was far from gone. It had only just begun. The room was still. The shards of the shattered mirror lay scattered across the floor, glistening like tiny, broken pieces of glass. Emma sat there, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to breathe normally. The air felt thick, but lighter, almost as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She looked around, half expecting the figure from the mirror to appear again. But the room was empty, silent. For a moment, she let herself believe it was over. The mirror was gone. The curse had been broken. She had won. But deep down, she knew better. The air still had a coldness to it, the kind that makes your skin prickle, as if something was watching her, waiting. Emma stood up shakily, brushing the dust and glass from her hands. She reached for the lamp, its dim light flickering, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally on the walls. She had to leave this place. She needed to get away from it all. But before she could take another step, she heard it. A low, barely audible whisper. It was soft at first, like the wind rustling through the trees, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was right next to her ear. "You can't escape me, Emma." Her heart stopped. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. There was no one there. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed to stretch and creep, moving in a way that couldn't be explained by the dim light alone. She could feel them, eyes watching her from the corners of the room, from behind the furniture, from the cracks in the walls. The curse was still there, deep inside her mind, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. "Leave now," a voice whispered again, this time from behind her. She turned, her body trembling with fear. But once again, the room was empty. She felt dizzy, as though the walls were closing in on her. The chill in the air deepened. It wasn't the cold of winter or the normal evening air. It was a presence, something alive, something that had been released when the mirror shattered. She had made a mistake. She thought destroying the mirror would end it, but the curse wasn't just bound to the glass. It had woven itself into her life, into her very soul. Emma stumbled backward, her eyes frantically searching the room. She grabbed her phone from the table, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial for help. But before she could press send, the screen flickered and went dark. Her heart pounded faster. She pressed the power button again, but it wouldn't turn on. "No escape," the voice whispered, now louder and more urgent. "You belong to me." She dropped the phone, her hands shaking violently as her mind struggled to process what was happening. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, breathing with a life of their own. The room, the house, it all felt wrong. The whispering came again, more persistent, more demanding. "You think you've won, but this is just the beginning." She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. The very air around her seemed to be closing in, suffocating her, pushing her toward the center of the room where she felt the weight of something dark and unrelenting. "You'll never be free," the voice echoed, a chilling promise. "You will be mine." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only sound her breath, shallow and panicked. She reached for the nearest lamp, but it slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. Emma could feel her pulse racing, the silence almost deafening now. It was as if the whole world had gone still, waiting, watching. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. The darkness around her seemed to shift, to move closer, pressing in from all sides. Then, in the dead silence of the room, she heard it. A faint scratching noise, like nails scraping against wood. Her head snapped toward the source of the sound, and her breath caught in her throat. In the corner of the room, the air shimmered. Slowly, impossibly, a figure began to form. First a shadow, then the outline of a face. A face she knew all too well. The same face from the mirror. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't trapped inside the glass. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Emma felt a wave of coldness wash over her, her breath coming out in visible puffs of mist. "You thought you could break the curse," the figure said, its voice cold and hollow, but it was never about the mirror. It was about you. Emma's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure was no longer just a reflection. It was real, standing in front of her, its cold eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. "You will never be free, Emma," it hissed, its lips curling into a twisted smile. "You belong to me, forever." The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and thin, like claws. Emma screamed, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded her. She could feel it, a cold, clammy grip wrapping around her heart, dragging her into the depths of the shadow. With one last, desperate gasp, Emma reached for the door. Her fingers grazed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness was closing in, suffocating her. She could feel the figure's cold breath on her skin, its grip tightening around her, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. Then, just as she thought she might lose herself entirely, the voice spoke again. But this time it wasn't the figures. It was a different voice. Faint, almost a whisper. "Fight it, Emma." The words seemed to come from somewhere far away, like a distant memory. It was the last sliver of hope she had. She had to fight back. She had to break free. With a surge of desperation, Emma pushed herself away from the figure, her body trembling. The darkness fought against her, pulling her back, but she refused to give in. She had to escape, but the figure was relentless, its grip unbreakable. And then, the world around her shattered into nothingness. The world felt heavy. Emma's head throbbed with an unbearable pain, as if her very thoughts were being crushed under the weight of something monstrous. She could barely keep her eyes open, her body shaking violently. Everything around her was dark, empty, silent. The air was thick with a presence, something watching her from just beyond her reach. She was no longer in her room. She wasn't sure where she was, but it didn't feel like the world she knew. The floor beneath her was cold, unnaturally so, and the walls seemed to stretch on forever, as though they were closing in on her. In the distance, a faint light flickered like a candle in the wind. She tried to focus on it, but her mind was clouded, her thoughts like a tangled web. Emma's chest tightened with fear. She didn't want to move, didn't want to go toward the light. But something inside her, something deeper than the fear, compelled her to stand. The pain in her head was excruciating, but she fought through it, dragging herself to her feet. Every step felt like a battle, her legs weak and unsteady. She looked down at her hands, trembling and pale, as though they weren't her own. Her fingers shook as she reached out, her skin ice cold to the touch. There, in front of her, a figure appeared. A shape, a shadow. It was vague at first, but it quickly solidified into a man, or at least the form of one. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence loomed over her like a weight. "You don't know how to fight this," the figure said, his voice distant and cold, like a whisper in a storm. "You never did." Emma tried to speak, but her throat felt dry, as if the words had been stolen from her. She swallowed hard, her breath shallow. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice weak and trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes hidden behind the shadows of his face. She felt the air around her grow colder with each step he took. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice full of a dark amusement. The mirror was never the cause. It was the object that chose you. The words hit Emma like a slap. The object? What did he mean? "The curse began the moment you laid eyes on it," the figure continued, his voice a whisper of darkness. "It was always meant for you. The mirror, the painting, the clock, it doesn't matter. They're all the same. But it's the one thing you can't escape. It finds you, it chooses you, and it never lets go." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that she wasn't safe. She had been chosen. The realization hit her like a cold wave, freezing her blood. Her mind raced back to the first moment she had touched that cursed mirror, the way it had felt in her hands, the way the reflection had shifted and changed. The whispers, the shadows, the terrible visions that had haunted her every night. It had never been just the mirror. It had been everything. "You're not just a victim," the figure said, his voice more forceful now. "You're part of it. The object is part of you, and you are part of it." Emma recoiled, trying to back away, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had turned to stone, holding her in place. "You can never escape," the figure whispered, his cold breath brushing against her ear. "It will follow you. It will consume you." Panic surged inside Emma. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the truth. The curse was never going to end. No matter how hard she tried to escape, it would follow her. It was already inside her, shaping her every move, every thought. Suddenly, the darkness around her shifted. The shadows began to twist and bend, growing larger, more menacing. The figure in front of her blurred and dissolved, replaced by something darker, something more ancient. "You will never be free," it growled, its voice low and guttural, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. "The object feeds on your fear, on your despair, and it will continue until there's nothing left of you." Emma's heart raced, her breath quickening. She could feel her body growing weaker, drained by the suffocating presence that surrounded her. She tried to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came. Her voice was gone, lost in the choking blackness. The world around her began to shift again, and she felt herself falling into a void, a place where time no longer mattered. She couldn't see, couldn't move. The darkness closed in, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. She gasped for air, her body jerking awake. The cold room was gone. She was back in her apartment, lying on the floor, her body drenched in sweat. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her breath came in ragged gasps. It was a dream. It had to be a dream. But the sense of terror, the feeling that something was still lurking, waiting, lingered. Emma sat up slowly, her hands trembling as she looked around the room. Everything was the same. The furniture, the walls, the mirror. The mirror. She froze. In the corner of the room, the mirror stood as if nothing had happened. But she could feel it now, the weight of its presence. It was waiting for her, watching her. The curse hadn't been broken. It had only just begun. The figure had been right. She couldn't escape. The mirror had chosen her, and it would never let go. Emma stood up, feeling the chill of the room seep into her bones. She couldn't fight it alone. She needed answers. She needed help. But it was too late. The mirror began to pulse, as if it were alive, a slow, steady rhythm that matched the beat of her heart. And in the reflection, Emma saw something she had never seen before. A figure, dark, looming and monstrous, stood just behind her, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. "You belong to me," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "Forever." Emma's heart raced as the figure in the mirror loomed behind her. It was no longer just a reflection. It was real. The dark, shadowy presence seemed to stretch and pulse, its shape ever-changing, as if it were made of darkness itself. "You belong to me," the voice whispered again, the words slithering into her mind, colder than ice. "There's no escape. You were always meant to be mine." She backed away from the mirror, her breath shallow, her skin clammy with fear. But the room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the space between her and the mirror shrank with every step. She turned around to look at the door. The exit was only a few feet away, but it felt as though it were miles away, surrounded by the oppressive presence of the entity in the mirror. The closer she got to the door, the more suffocating the air became, thick with dread. But she couldn't just leave. She couldn't abandon the fight. The figure's voice echoed louder in her mind, filling her thoughts with terror. "You can run," it hissed, "but you'll never outrun me. I am inside you now. The curse has taken root. There's no turning back." Emma's legs felt weak beneath her, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had been running from this moment for so long, trying to escape the curse, but now there was nowhere left to go. The mirror, this cursed object, had ensnared her. There was no denying it any longer. But in that moment, something inside her stirred, a spark of defiance. She refused to let this thing, this nightmare, control her any longer. She would not let it win. Emma turned toward the mirror, her hands shaking, but determination lighting a fire in her chest. She stepped closer to the reflective surface, her breath catching in her throat. The figure in the mirror grew stronger, its features becoming clearer. It was no longer a shadow, but something darker, almost human, with cold, empty eyes that burned with malice. "You can't stop it," the voice said, louder now, as if it were surrounding her, pressing in from all directions. "You were always meant to be my vessel. You will serve me." The words were poison, seeping into her mind, trying to break her. But Emma stood her ground. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. The chill that ran through her hand was like a jolt of electricity, sending a shock through her body. She gasped, but her resolve did not waver. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but strong. "I refuse to let you control me." The mirror trembled. The figure inside it howled, its face contorting in rage, its eyes widening as if in disbelief. It tried to reach for her, its hands stretching out from the glass, but Emma stepped back, her heart pounding. "This ends now," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I won't be your puppet. I'll destroy you." Suddenly, the mirror cracked. A sharp sound, like glass breaking, echoed through the room. Emma stumbled back, her breath quickening. The cracks spread across the mirror's surface, like veins of darkness slowly tearing apart the reflection. The figure in the mirror screamed in fury, its form twisting and writhing, trying to hold itself together. But it was too late. Emma pushed forward, her hand still touching the glass, her fingers trembling as the cracks deepened. "You can't escape me," the entity growled, but its voice was weaker now, as if the power was slipping from it. Emma gathered every ounce of strength she had left. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the stillness of the room calm her racing heart. And then, with one final push, she slammed her hand against the mirror. The glass shattered. For a moment, everything went silent. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood in the broken shards of the mirror. The figure, the curse, the darkness, it was gone. There was only the broken reflection of her own face staring back at her. She stood there, still listening. The weight that had crushed her chest for so long lifted. The oppressive darkness, the fear, it was all gone. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emma looked around the room, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than it had been in days. She had done it. She had destroyed the curse, or so she thought. She turned toward the door, her legs shaking, but a sense of relief flooding through her. She reached for the handle and paused. There was something in the air, something faintly wrong. She turned back to the shattered mirror. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something move in the broken pieces. A flicker, a shift in the darkness that lingered in the shards. Her heart skipped a beat. No, she thought. It was over. She had to believe that. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A faint outline, a figure forming in the fragments of the broken mirror. A hand reaching out. And in that moment, she realized. The curse hadn't been broken at all. It had only just begun. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the broken shards of the mirror. The hand, slowly emerging from the shattered glass, seemed impossibly real. Its fingers stretching out toward her, as if beckoning her to fall into its grasp. Her breath hitched in her throat, and a chill ran through her entire body. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs felt as though they were rooted to the floor. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to flee this place, but her body refused to obey. The hand moved closer, its cold fingers brushing against the edges of the shards, as if testing the air. The darkness around her seemed to grow thicker, heavier, swallowing the light in the room. The room itself seemed to close in on her, the walls bending toward her like a trap ready to snap shut. And then, she heard it, the voice. "You cannot escape me, Emma," it whispered, its tone like the hiss of a snake, slithering into her very soul. "You thought you could break the mirror, break the curse. But you were wrong. You are mine, and you always will be." The voice, once cold and distant, now seemed to be inside her head, echoing around her mind, filling her thoughts. She could feel the pressure, the pull of the darkness trying to overwhelm her, like a wave crashing over her, drowning her in its suffocating weight. "I will make sure of it," the voice continued, growing more forceful, more malicious. "No matter how many times you try to break free, I will always be there. You cannot destroy what is already inside you." Emma's breathing quickened, her pulse racing as the darkness crept closer, wrapping itself around her like tendrils of smoke. Her vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to shift, warping into something unrecognizable, as if the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. The hand, now fully formed, reached out for her. Its fingers were long and pale, the skin unnaturally smooth, like polished marble, but cold and lifeless. It seemed to pulse with the same darkness that had filled the mirror, like a part of it had come to life. Emma felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat as the hand brushed against her arm. It was like ice against her skin, sending a shock through her body, freezing her in place. Her mind screamed in terror, but her body was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of the curse. She fought against the darkness, fighting to regain control over her body, over her thoughts. The mirror, the reflection, the figure. It had been her nightmare for so long, but now she realized it wasn't just the mirror that held the curse. It had always been inside her, a part of her, feeding on her fear, her weakness. "You can't fight it," the voice taunted, its tone mocking. "You are already mine. There is no escape." There never was, but Emma refused to surrender. She couldn't let it win. She had fought too hard, too long, to let this thing consume her. With every ounce of strength she had left, she reached for the broken shards of glass. Her fingers scraped against the sharp edges, blood pooling in her palm, but she didn't stop. She clenched the shards in her hand, feeling the sharp pain as the glass dug into her skin. The pain was real, but it grounded her. It reminded her that she was still human, still alive, still fighting. She lifted the shard high, the broken glass shimmering in the dim light, and slammed it down toward the mirror. But the moment it touched the shards of glass, everything froze. A deep, unnatural silence filled the room. Time itself seemed to stop, and the darkness withdrew, just for a brief moment. In that instant, Emma saw it, the truth. The curse had never been confined to the mirror. It was a part of her, buried deep inside, feeding on her fear, on her insecurities. She had let it in, allowed it to grow. And no matter how many mirrors she shattered, no matter how many times she fought back, it would always return. The mirror shattered in her mind. The shards fell like snowflakes, each one carrying a piece of the darkness with it. But Emma knew now that there was no escaping it, no matter how much she tried. She wasn't just fighting a curse. She was fighting herself. With trembling hands, she let the shard fall from her grasp. the sharp edges clinking as they hit the floor. The room went dark, the shadows closing in around her like a suffocating blanket. But in the deep silence that followed, she understood. The curse would never truly end. It would follow her always, and the mirror would always be with her, reflecting the darkness within. The silence stretched on, the world spinning out of control, as Emma finally surrendered to the inevitable. And somewhere, in the broken fragments of the shattered glass, a shadow watched her, waiting for the next time she would try to escape. The curse had begun, and it would never end.